babies. Here we go. Like it's cold.
Charlie Wright is a fish tech with the Klamath tribes. Right now, she's releasing hatchery salmon into southern Oregon's upper Klamath Basin.
How pretty green they turn here.
It's the end of 2023, and these fish are the very beginning of what could be the first run of spring Chinook to survive here in more than a century. That's because since the early 1900s, salmon were blocked by dams from reaching these waters. But as we've talked about on this pod before, the country's largest dam removal project took down 4 dams in 2023 and 2024, reopening the basin to salmon. And now that they're out, Wright is back at the creek once again. There's no salmon up here yet, so her family's fishing for rainbow trout.
Oh man, I don't know if you can get that one. Can you see it?
No?
The fish that we released, some of them did make it all the way to the ocean. And that'd be crazy to see that some of them come back in the next few years. That would be, I don't know, I could just burst with joy for that.
Even with the 4 dams out, the path to this tributary is a tricky one. It runs through 2 dams, Keno and Link River Dam, that weren't removed and weren't built for adult salmon passage. The water stagnates here, and lake water above the dams is often toxic. If they could find their way, the creeks up here would offer great habitat for salmon near the headwaters of the Klamath River that bubble up from underground springs.
We're just praying they can make it past the Keno and Link River Dam, because to truly bring the salmon home, they need to be able to be in these watersheds up here.
From the Gert Boyle studio, I'm Jen Chavez, and this is The Evergreen, a podcast from OPB about the place you call home. In the past, we've talked about the history behind the largest dam removal project in the United States, the long fight over water in the Klamath Basin, the process of getting the dams out, and what dam removal means to the tribes along the river. Today, we're bringing you up to date. What's on folks' minds now that the dams are out a year later? And what still needs to be done to piece this basin together again? Cassandra Profita is an editor and reporter at OPB. She's been covering the Klamath Dam Removal Project for years and joins us to talk about life after the dams. Cassandra, welcome back to The Evergreen. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
How many salmon were seen both in the Klamath River and the Klamath Lake and the streams above it before the dams were built in the early 1900s? And what are folks doing to encourage them to swim again?
Okay, so if you count up all of the anadromous fish historically seen in the Klamath River, that would be fall Chinook, spring Chinook, steelhead, and coho salmon. It was more than 1 million salmonids that were swimming up this river. The Klamath was home to one of the largest salmon runs on the whole West Coast. And of course, the biggest thing that's happened to rebuild these fish was the removal of 4 dams on the river over the last 2 years. And so a huge swath of the river is now reconnected and flowing freely from southern Oregon all the way to the ocean. And that means a lot of great habitat has been reopened for salmon and steelhead, so they have more places to feed and spawn and make more salmon.
Yeah. And these 4 dams that we keep talking about along the Klamath River came down in 2023 and 2024. The Iron Gate Dam, Copco 1 Dam, Copco 2 Dam, and the J.C. Boyle Dam.
Wow. Yeah. Look at that. Here we go. You all right?
That was the sound of Klamath tribal members in January of 2024 when the J.C. Boyle Dam came out. Cassandra, there are 2 dams still up. So give us the rundown. Why didn't they come out, and where are they located? And what problems are these dams causing?
Yeah, there's still 2 dams left on the river, even after the country's largest dam removal project, right? So this is Keno and Link River dams. They sit right below Upper Klamath Lake, and they're used to control and direct water from Upper Klamath Lake to farms and ranches, also to control the flows of water going down the Klamath River. Water management on the Klamath is a really big deal, and so controlling that water and deciding which way it goes is actually like a pretty big function for the remaining dams. The biggest problem that those dams are causing right now, though, is they're likely blocking the salmon that are returning to Oregon from going any higher in the Klamath watershed, which is a pretty big bummer. So there are these tributaries above Upper Klamath Lake that would really provide great habitat for salmon. As you go up above the lake, you get closer and closer to the headwaters of the river, where this clean, cold water bubbles up from these underground springs, and it just makes the perfect place for salmon to be. And so while those 2 dams that remain, they do have fish ladders. Their fish ladders were not built for adult salmon. And essentially because the dams further downriver had cut off the salmon coming to Oregon, right? And so
it didn't even make sense.
It wasn't needed, right?
Yeah.
You didn't need fish ladders that allowed salmon to pass. So last year, we watched the salmon swim past the former dam sites and all the way up into Oregon, into Spencer Creek, and we were so lucky to actually see that happening. But, that's really about as far north as people saw those fish. The people did see them in the fish ladder at Keno Dam, but nobody saw them beyond that point. And now we're looking at, what needs to be done to allow salmon to pass over those dams. But experts I've talked to said they're just probably not big enough for the adult salmon.
And what conversations are happening about the remaining dams amongst the people that live along the river?
The Klamath tribes are leading a conversation about those remaining dams. And they're in a good position to do that because the courts have decided that they have a time immemorial water right on many of the waterways in the upper basin. So they have a lot of power to influence water management decisions. A couple weeks ago, I got a chance to talk with the chairman of the Klamath tribes, William E. Ray Jr., and he's pretty frustrated that these 2 remaining dams are blocking this last stretch of the river.
Our biggest issue and opportunity is getting the fish around the Keno and Link River impediments.
That would allow the salmon to swim up into these nice, cold, clear, spring-fed rivers like the Williamson.
That's the goal. And we've laid that out with the Bureau of Reclamation and the Fish and Wildlife Service on December 13th when we had a visit in 2024.
And so he's been agitating for federal and state agencies to do what needs to be done to get the salmon past those dams.
We're not wanting to be patient anymore. We're not wanting to wait.
I also spoke with the Ombudot director for the Klamath tribes, Alta Harris. Ombudot is like their natural resources department. And she told me that there's this feasibility study that's going to look at all the options for what they can do at Keno Dam, including whether they can take that whole dam out, which is, of course, what the tribes would like to see.
Dam removal is always the preferred choice. In this case, as with any dams on large rivers, that needs to be done carefully and thoughtfully to make sure that it is restored, because part of the construction of dams often is to notch reefs and allow water to be drawn down lower than it naturally would have. We would like to see that dam removed to have a freer river for those fish coming back. We just want to make sure that it's done in the best possible way for fish entering the system.
If these dams do come out, will that be enough to help the salmon?
Unfortunately, no. The habitat in this upper Klamath Basin is still very damaged from more than a century of being manipulated for agriculture. There were hundreds of thousands of acres of wetlands that were drained in this area to create farmland. And the Sprague River, it was diked to keep it from flooding out onto the surrounding farms. There's all these farms and ranches now that are operating in the area, and they're polluting the waterways with nutrients like phosphorus. And that triggers these big blooms of toxic bacteria that everybody likes to call toxic algae blooms. That makes it very inhospitable for fish. So when I talked with the chairman, he was adamant that everyone needs to work towards reducing pollution from farms and ranches and restore more of those drained wetlands. They actually do a really good job of filtering those extra nutrients out of the water and preventing the toxic bacterial growth.
The next big challenge is all the restoration of wetlands and working up on our upper watershed, the headwaters, where we can try to divert and trap as much as the nutrient loading from the phosphorus and so forth, so it doesn't go down into the lake.
Interesting. So this conversation that you had with the Klamath chairman, William E. Ray Jr., and Alta Harris took place at the Lower Klamath Basin Renaissance Tour in March of 2025. And all the big players were there, the tribes, agricultural districts, and environmentalists. This was an opportunity to hear from all of these different perspectives along the Klamath River. Who hosted the tour, and what was the vibe between all the folks there? Was there tension?
Yeah, the tour was hosted by the Klamath Drainage District, which is a group of farmers, and they've actually expressed interest in helping to repair some of this ecosystem that they're farming in, especially if it helps them to get some more solid guarantees for water supplies on their farms.
Yeah.
And so there's naturally some tension between farmers and tribes in the basin because they all need water for different reasons, and there really isn't enough water to go around. But they've all been through a lot of water fights already, and now they seem to have an understanding that, there's some places where we can get along. And one of those areas is in trying to restore wetland habitat and water flows to these wildlife refuges, which are actually at the bottom of the list for water rights. And so they've been drying up in the summer. And we've had birds dying from botulism. And it's a really horrible sight that really no one wants to see. And so the Klamath Drainage District hosted this tour so that everyone could learn a little bit more about what are the possible solutions here. And the director of the Klamath Drainage District, Scott White, led the tour. He talked about, how they've all been through a lot together.
I think people are ready to strap their boots up and get to work in the basin again. I mean, we've gone through a handful of circumstances from, so many years of hard work building the Klamath Basin Restoration Agreement. And then it failed.
And they've made it to this point where they can work together on restoration projects that will benefit everyone.
How can we be helpful rather than put the boxing gloves on and try to fight it? Let's see if we can be helpful. But in return, we need to make sure that we're taken care of.
Of course, there were still moments on the tour where we saw tensions that still exist. At one point, we were learning about the Fish and Wildlife Service's efforts to restore chwam and koptu. And those are two endangered species of suckerfish that depend on Upper Klamath Lake. And at one point, the Klamath chairman, he really called out the agency folks for failing to recognize this vast indigenous knowledge that the Klamath people have for those fish and their history in the Klamath Basin.
How many of us ate or fished those fish in this room? You fished them?
I caught them while I was trout fishing.
So here again, 1988 is when we stopped fishing them. Okay, so before that, when I was growing up, fished them, millions of them.
You could just really hear the frustration in his voice. He fished for chwam and koptu and their relatives, which are three other species of fish that he says the federal government hasn't even acknowledged.
They've been relegated to these certain areas to survive when they used to be throughout the system. And I'll tell you examples of three species that we haven't even talked about.
And he and the Klamath people, had to stop fishing for all of those species in the late 1980s because their populations were so endangered. And they're really not recovering, which is terrible news for the Klamath people and their culture.
And until you start listening to the fishermen in the Klamath, then we have that knowledge that we're missing. As a tribal member who's fished those fish, subsisted on those fish, to see that we haven't been able to fish them since 1988, 1909, we're at a breaking point in our culture.
The chairman told everyone, hey, we know what the problem is here, and we need to bring back the wetlands that were drained.
I can't emphasize the need to figure out a way, especially with this federal funding, on how we're going to support one another in these projects. And whatever we plan in there, they don't have a chance because they can't hide. There's not enough wetlands. That's what it boils down to. Thank you.
Okay, and there are other updates I want to get into, but first we should address federal funding and job cuts. The Trump administration suspended funding from the 2021 bipartisan infrastructure law, which helps rebuild the ecological infrastructure of the Klamath River. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration employees who facilitated those projects have been fired. Folks that were on the tour, how are they feeling about all these fast-moving changes, and how does this affect the work on the Klamath?
Oh my gosh, there were some really ominous moments, and it was really sad because there actually is a lot of positive momentum on the Klamath now with the dam removal, and then you could just kind of hear it fall apart when anyone brought up the fact that all of these restoration projects that they've all been working together to plan for years are contingent on this federal funding that's frozen. So it was hard to see. It was hard to watch. There's one project in particular that everyone was talking about. They call it the Big Swing, that would focus on knocking down a bunch of the dikes along the Sprague River so that the river could spill its banks and create the marshy wetland habitat that this area is really missing. And they're nearly halfway through that project. And now the funding's frozen. So it was pretty hard to hear that very palpable sadness and frustration.
We've been doing this work and advocating for it since the early 70s as the Klamath tribes. And every time we've made moves, there have been certain things jerked back.
Long before dam removal, they had put together a whole package of solutions that included dam removal and habitat restoration for the basin. And those were stymied when Congress failed to pass the Klamath Basin Restoration Agreement. And that was like a decade ago.
And it takes a lot of cooperation to get that money to begin with between us, the Klamath tribes, the irrigators, the private landowners, the people that were all part of this system. And without that rug being pulled out from her, it's hard to say that we're going to make progress quickly in order to save our mullet from extinction. That's how critical it is.
And then a member of the Yurok tribe named Frankie Myers reminded me that, this group is really all too familiar with the kind of frustration that they're experiencing now.
There's folks working on restoration that don't know if they're going to have a job tomorrow. There's planning that has been taken over 10 years to come to that is supposed to be implemented this year that may not be implemented. It is beyond frustrated because the people who are supposed to be showing up for us and a government who is supposed to be there when we need them, when we come together, is absolutely absent. And worse than being absent is working against us, working against people who have lived here for generations, who are doing hard work, who have every single reason to be validated on the projects that we're doing. We're being attacked. And that's extremely frustrating.
And they know they have another fight ahead of them to claw back as much of this funding as they can.
Coming up after a break, we're going to hear more on how the largest dam removal project in the country is shaping up a year later. We'll hear from farmers next. Stay with us. Thanks for listening to The Evergreen, our podcast from OPB about the place you call home. If you like what you hear, subscribe to us on your favorite podcast app, and we'll brighten your Monday morning a little bit with something new and fascinating to listen to each week. You can also follow OPB on Instagram at OPB Photo, or follow me directly at Jen Chavez OPB. That's Jen with 2 N's, and I will keep you posted on what Team Evergreen is up to. And remember, this episode about life after the Klamath Dam removal and all the great OPB reporting and storytelling you hear on this show is made possible by the support of many thousands of wonderful OPB members. That is the beauty of public media, my friends. Support our journalism by becoming an OPB sustaining member today at opb.org/pod. And now, back to the show. So, Cassandra, in previous episodes we've done with you, we've highlighted the heated history of water wars in the Klamath Basin, how dam removal has given tribes along the river new hope.
By building the dams and by taking the water away, they took our fish. Fish is our life.
And left farmers uncertain.
You either got to stand up and take it, or you're not going to ever have water here again.
So, Cassandra, how are things looking now, a year later, between these two groups?
Yeah, there's a very tumultuous history in this basin where, water shortages led to the federal government cutting off the water to farmers, and then they cut up the water to salmon. Both of those actions created a tremendous amount of pain, and now everyone is like, okay, let's avoid that pain in the future. Now, a lot more people are understanding that salmon restoration is a win-win for everyone. And so we followed some farmers down to the homeland of the Karuk tribe because they wanted to learn more about what the salmon need to survive. They want to be part of a solution here, and so they went down to learn. And one of the farmers we met there, Scotty Fenters, was very clear that now he sees salmon restoration as his ticket to a more reliable water supply and a more stable future for himself and his family.
I view the salmon downriver, especially for the tribes, in no different than my own crops. They're trying to catch their fish. It's part of their heritage. I want them to succeed as best as possible because their success is my success. If we can get the salmon to come back, maybe we can get a little bit of water security again, which would go a really long way.
Scott White talked about, this is a big deal for farmers.
What does it mean to have salmon up here? How can we prepare for this? Going down there, seeing the salmon, I think you just start connecting dots, right? Okay, these fish may be back up here in 3 years. We want to make sure that they're giving them a good fighting chance to go spawn and make more salmon. If the fish win, we all win.
And so now, we see a lot more cooperation among the farmers and tribes happening that, now that the dams are out and farmers have kind of seen the dark side of what this fight looks like, and they want to get to a happier place where salmon are healthy and they don't need to take so much water from the farmers.
And so I know these farmers are also planning on adding wetlands to their properties. So tell me how that changes things.
Yeah, the wetland projects are really cool. They're called walking wetlands sometimes. It depends. You can put a permanent wetland on your farm, right, and just give up that land forever. There's also these temporary wetlands where you would say, okay, for the next 2 years, these fields are going to be wetlands. And then they're going to move to those fields. And you get these wetland benefits for the 2 years that you have a wetland. And water is actually really good at killing weeds. So once you've done that, the farmers can then take that land and farm organically without weed killers. And so the farmers are actually pretty happy, the ones that have done these wetlands. There are farmers who have done permanent wetlands as well. And the benefit is that then they have water on their farm, right? The ground is rehydrated. The aquifer may get a little bit of recharge. Fish and wildlife are happy. And then the farmers actually have some pretty healthy land to plant on in the future.
That's cool.
It's a win-win.
Yeah, totally. And as you mentioned earlier, there's still this struggle with the two remaining dams. Salmon cannot pass through to the upper Klamath Lake. What comes next might be another fight to take down more dams, those last two. Do you suspect it will be another decade-long fight?
I honestly cannot tell how big of a fight we're going to see here. If both dams are to come out, yes, it will be a long fight. The efforts to remove Keno Dam seem like they're moving along, and that seems more likely to happen. Keno Dam's just not quite as critical to agriculture as Link River Dam. Link River Dam is where I'd expect to see more of a fight, if we're going to see one. Certainly some Klamath tribal members want to see it out, but there's also an understanding among the leadership that removal might not be a viable option because this massive agricultural industry depends on that dam to distribute irrigation water. I'd say regardless, there is a feeling that there is a lot of work to do, and that now that those first 4 dams are out, the rest of the work can begin.
We all know the pieces fit together because we all watched it fall apart. So we know it can be successful and healthy again, but we have to get it there. We have to do the work.
So Cassandra, I know you've been covering this story for a really long time, and you just finished up a lovely 30-minute documentary for OPB's Oregon Field Guide about the dam removals. After all this time you've invested in this story, what do you want people to take away from it?
You know, I really hope that people can see solutions in this story that were hard to get to, right? Like, solutions are hard. It took a lot of compromise to get those dams out, and it's going to take more compromise to rebuild the habitat above those dams so that it works for farmers, it works for fish, it works for tribes, it works for everyone as well as it can. You know, these farmers in the upper basin are talking about using their irrigation canals to carry water to wildlife refuges so that fish and wildlife can benefit from that water, which is a really nice gesture. And it's kind of the best we can do at this time to put back something that, I heard a really great quote on that tour, something that rhymes with what used to be there. I think it was a farmer named Carl Wenner.
But we're going to use natural processes. We're going to harness those with the infrastructure that we have and harness those natural processes to recreate and make it rhyme with what used to be.
You know, we're not going to undo all of this rearrangement that happened in the upper basin, especially because so many people's livelihoods now depend on the farms that exist there. But it was really encouraging for me to learn about the tribes and the farmers getting together to talk about what's possible in the future. And so I really want people to hear some hope here. Even if it's not just the easiest solution that's going to solve every problem overnight, it's a solution, and it's usually these are the kinds of solutions that we land on. They're not easy and they're not clean cut. They're kind of messy, they're kind of complicated, and of course, they're even more complicated now with federal funding frozen.
Well, Cassandra, thank you so much for all your hard work covering this, and thanks so much for being with us in the studio today.
Thanks for having me.
You can watch the new Oregon Field Guide documentary on the Klamath Dam removals at opb.org. Thank you for listening to The Evergreen, a podcast from OPB. Join us next week to learn about the Northwest history of the Bracero program, which brought Mexican farm and railroad workers to the U.S. on contract at a time of dire labor shortages set off by World War II. Mia Estrada produced this episode, and our technical director is Stephen Cray. Nalene Silva engineered the episode. The OPB podcast team also includes Julie Sabatier and Sage Van Wing. Cassandra Profita, Stephanie Gordon, and Todd Sonfleeth did the interviews you heard. We used a sound bite from CNN of a farmer protesting in 2001. The music in this episode is from Audio Network. If you have a question for us, please reach out. Email us at theevergreen@opb.org. I'm Jen Chavez. Catch you later.